He pressed his body against hers as if he could anchor her to the world with the heat of his mouth. The hallway lights fractured against the mirrored walls, and somewhere behind them a panel of glass shattered, and a rain of sparks traced the air like a slow, brutal constellation. Gunfire chewed the silence into ragged breaths. Valentina Serrano's steel gaze loosened for one impossible human instant. Surprise, horror, the flash of a woman who had never let anyone cross the line between duty and tenderness. And then she clutched at his shoulders as if she would physically wrench him away, because the optics were everything, and she was the last person who could afford a mistake. Miguel smelled like lemon floor cleaner and the copper tang of fear. He tasted of desperation and something softer. The memory of hands he once held in a field hospital that no longer existed for him. The cameras blinked. The hallway security feed would replay this kiss. At midnight, the whole city would see a janitor become the lover-guardian of the widowed Donna of the Serrano Empire. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. When the last gunshot ate itself and silence slammed back in, Miguel pulled away because he could not have her, with a single drop of blood on him. He expected outrage, commands barked by the men who had trained their faces to be marble, expected the security detail to leap and tear them apart to preserve the illusion of order. Instead, Valentina's hand slid from his shoulder to the back of his head with an owner's precision that made his scalp prickle. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was not the roaring thunder he'd been warned about. It was low, a baritone edged with a grief that had learned to bite when gentleness threatened to show. "We need a story," she said, and the weight of her world settled on his ribs like a heavy coat. "Tell them you saved me. Tell them you're with me." Miguel had been a field medic once, bandaging knees in refugee camps and trading cigarettes with soldiers who smelled of diesel and regret. Back then, names had been cheap and promises cheaper. He had learned to give away pieces of himself because people forgot and left. He had returned to the city with a certificate no one cared to verify and a daughter who slept with a flashlight under her blanket because the bulbs in their apartment gave off shadows like monsters. He took the night shift at Serrano Tower because it paid in consistent envelopes and because the tower's side door opened onto 2 subway stops that meant Lena could go to school in the mornings. He was careful. He kept his head down, his hands busy with a mop, his heart wrapped in duct tape. He had never planned on kissing a Donna. Valentina Serrano moved like someone born to fill a room with command. Her hair was the dark, glossy flag of a family relic, her posture a set of practiced decrees. The Serrano Empire was a lattice of servers, investments disguised as fog, safe houses, the occasional necessary violence. Her husband's brain had been a map of code and ruthlessness, and when he died, the cartography remained, messy and lethal. She wore mourning like armor because the world of the Serranos never had room for soft places. The top-floor office where she ruled was more interrogation chamber than private suite. Glass that shrugged off bullets, a long oak desk that had swallowed men whole, a portrait of the late patriarch that seemed to judge anyone who dared smile without thinking of consequence. The assassin unit had come with a cold, clinical hunger. They were not the reckless, cocksure type you saw in movies. These were technicians of elimination, tight with silencers, and even tighter with the knowledge of algorithms that could call favors and debts into being. The threat that had slid into Valentina's inbox a week ago, an anonymous dossier with a single sentence and a clean, impossible threat, "We own your people's names now," had been dismissed by her analysts as bluster. They had underestimated a cartel that weaponized data, a shadow outfit that could erase bank accounts and flicker bodies off the grid by pulling strings through codes and corrupted chains of custody. That same night, the lights had flickered and the tower's emergency protocol had sprung like a trap door. Someone had cut access. Someone had reached in and stolen the safety of routine. Miguel could see the tiny details that disconnected him from the world of power. Valentina's silvery cuff was a family signet, her phone's main screen populated with encrypted channels rather than weather apps. The way men moved around her like planets, predictably orbiting or explosively colliding. In those first breathless moments after his impulsive act, their skin was still hot from the collision, but the air tasted of terrible geometry. He knew he had given her a plausible narrative for the cameras, but he had also gifted the Serrano name a new fault line. A janitor kissing a Donna would confuse rivals. It would force anyone who considered striking to hesitate. Nobody wanted to be the one who murdered a woman whose lover, however low, might pull a knife from his own life's cloth. Those were the precise optics Valentina needed. She accepted them like a necessary operation. "Tell me your name," she demanded 2 minutes later, when armored men were sweeping the corridors and the electricity drone had the taste of burnt wires on Miguel's tongue. "Miguel Alvarez," he said. It was more than a name. It was a life filled with rent receipts, a daughter who loved dinosaurs, and a past stitched with the memory of a nurse who had smiled at him in a churchyard in a country he could barely remember. He wanted to tell her everything, about the NGO, about the field hospitals, about how he once swore he'd never let fear keep him from saving a life. But there was a price to truth at Serrano Tower. He swallowed. "I work nights." Valentina's eyes flicked to the cameras, to the men, to the corridor that had been scraped clean of blood. "You'll say that to them," she said. "You will be the man who pulled me back. When they ask why, you will say you saw the shooters and you pushed me out of the line. You'll say you loved me enough to risk yourself." He thought of Lena, of her soft breath under a thrifted quilt, of the way she smoothed his collar in the morning when he looked too tired to leave. He thought of the envelopes, the nights he read stories in a voice he'd learned from black and white cartoons. If lying kept Lena safe, he would fold himself into the shape of the lie. "Yes," he said. The single syllable felt like stepping onto ice. The aftermath tightened around them like a water. Word would travel fast, through the family's channels, through the alleyways where deals were whispered, through the online marketplaces where a cartel's cruelty could be predicted like a storm. Miguel understood the currency of pretense. In his old life, he had often improvised to keep bodies alive. This was improvisation on a different scale. He would need to play a part he had not auditioned for. Protector, lover, pawn. Valentina would need him to be convincing. He would need her to be more than the steel and the portrait and the courtroom in an office chair. "You have a child," she said abruptly, as if she had read a file that no one else had. It was a statement, not a question. Miguel felt his spine hum. No one in the building had every reason to know anything about Lena. He did not force the details smaller than it felt. "7," he said. "Her name is Lena Alvarez." Valentina's face softened for the barest of instants, the light in her features shifting like a shadow over a statue. "You don't bring children into our world," she said, and it was accusation and pleading braided. She spoke with the authority of someone who had to carry consequences like lead. Miguel laughed, a short sound that dissolved into the echo of the corridor. "I didn't bring her into anything. She was born into my life the way weather happens." The men around them worked with military efficiency, checking for planted devices, rerouting feeds, issuing orders in clipped Spanish that Miguel understood well enough to know they were now all working from a new map, one that had him somewhere in the margins, with a declaration that would have to be rehearsed at breakfast and on the news cycle by noon. Valentina moved with a proprietor's grace. She dictated a press release in 2 sentences and then fixed him with a look that cut through the grease and mop smell he carried like armor. "You will learn to speak like my man," she said, and there was no malice, only the cold clarity of someone used to commanding people into roles they did not know how to play. On his way out, Miguel walked through the maintenance corridors, past flickering emergency lights and boxes of supplies, past the elevator shaft that hummed with the heart of the building. He could feel the scrape of camera eyes behind his back like a rumor. The staircase took forever. His feet counted the steps like prayers. He imagined Lena making spaghetti with too much salt, and the way she would tell him about recess, the way she would count the stars in the ceiling of her tiny room and decide each one was a secret. He told himself the lie. This was for her. But even as he recited that truth, the kiss burned in his memory differently. It had been more than a calculated shield. There had been a warmth in the press of lips that made his chest ache. He had not expected a Donna to have something that could thaw. Outside the tower, night smelled of wet concrete and a distant fryer's oil. His phone buzzed with a single message, audio snippets from the tower's feed forwarded by someone with a too friendly interest in drama. Miguel breathed and pocketed the device. He walked back toward the subway, toward Lena's 2-stop world where the danger could not touch her if he did everything right. He was small in the light of the city. Last week's cobweb of courage still clung to him. The narrative he'd stepped into would not hold forever. He knew that. Valentina's enemies would not simply see a lie and shrug. Somewhere, a cartel was tightening its algorithmic fist, and somewhere else, a traitor might be waiting with knowledge like a gun. At his doorway he paused, hands on the cold handle, and imagined the coming morning. Valentina's men rehearsing the story with reporters, the Serrano name swallowed into trending tags, Lena asking why Daddy smelled like business and blood. Miguel opened the door to a small apartment that contained a bookshelf mostly of children's picture books, a chipped mug of mismatched spoons, and a sleeping girl who would wake at dawn and believe the world was as small and safe as the quilt around her shoulders. He crossed the room and watched her breathe. He had invented a role to keep her safe for another day. But the role was a bridge into a place that offered both shelter and peril. A place where a janitor and a Donna's lives would knot together under threat and the unlikely warmth of human contact. He would have to learn fast how to stand under weight and not collapse. Miguel woke before dawn with the taste of iron still pricking the back of his throat, as if the tower's gunfire had lodged itself behind his teeth. Lena was at his side within seconds, always an early rising blur of energy and questions. She smelled of warm milk and the lemon soap he used to scrub floors. She padded to the kitchen, humming a cartoon theme, and Miguel let her. Routine was a small religion. It held them together when the city felt like a breakdown waiting to happen. "Daddy?" Lena asked, pouring cereal with the solemn concentration of a tiny general. "Did you see the lady on TV last night? She's on the big old building. Is she famous?" Miguel froze, spoon midair. The television above the stove, an old thing that had a cracked corner and picked up static when the elevators in the crook of the city hummed weird, was on the breakfast news. A still image of Valentina Serrano filled the screen. Dark hair coiled like a crown, eyes narrowed into a private weather. The caption read, "Donna Valentina survives attempted assassination at Serrano Tower." "Yeah," he said, his voice adjusting into something flatter than it felt. "She's important." Lena accepted that like a fact of nature and folded her knees onto the chair. Miguel watched her for a long moment. The lie he had told last night was already elastic, stretched thin across 2 worlds. He had thought the danger could be mapped and contained inside the tower's glass, a thing he could wear for a night like an ugly suit to be shed in the morning. He had not realized how easily such a suit could fuse to skin. At school, he told Lena the same rehearsed truth he'd given the tower's men. He had been where he belonged, cleaning the lobby when he heard noises, when things happened, and he had pushed a woman away from harm. He did not say Donna. He said a woman. To Lena, who loved stories with monsters and heroes, this was a satisfying outline. Miguel kissed the top of her head and left before the conversation could twist into dangerous curiosity. Later, when the bus brought Lena to her classroom and she waved without worry, Miguel felt for a moment as if he might actually be able to keep this secret and neat thing between him and his conscience. He returned to Serrano Tower on a shift he'd never thought would become something like performance art. The night staff, security men who normally had the emotional range of a locked door, had been given orders: keep the story tight, cue the cameras, handle the press. Valentina had instructed her communications chief to draft a narrative of gratitude and private bravery. It was a script that required Miguel to be convincing in a dozen small details. The sound of gunfire in the hallway, the pressure of the shove, the way he'd felt the hairs on his neck lift when he realized she was in danger. They rehearsed once, twice, then let him go for the cameras. Miguel learned to lean into the part with the shaky breath of someone who had nearly died for love. The camera loved him because he looked real. Love, even a contrived version of it, loosened the face. Between takes, Valentina watched him with an attention that was clinical and oddly searching. When the lights were down and the crew had scattered into the building like workers after a storm, she found him folding a mop cloth with the precision of someone who had been taught to make small, ordered things in a world that otherwise refused to behave. She stood in the doorway and spoke his name only once. Miguel. Yes, Donna. The reflex seemed ridiculous in daylight. He forced it out like an old habit and then saw the way she flinched at the title, at the word that separated her from the rest of the city. You wanted. You were brave. The word slid out, small and oddly awkward, from someone who had been taught to govern by decree, not by affirmation. Don't make the mistake of thinking I asked you to risk yourself. I would never ask that. She stopped, as if the shape of what she was giving him needed to be measured. But I am grateful. Gratitude did strange things to Miguel's chest. It was not tenderness. He had learned to recognize what tenderness looked like in the soft-handed nurses of his old life. But it softened the edges of the job he had given himself. It was also leverage. Gratitude could be cultivated into loyalty. Valentina's eyes slid away, and for a second the woman behind the monarchy appeared. Sharp, guarded, the kind of person who kept a ledger of owing and owed. You understand what this means for you now? She asked. People will see. People will talk. Those who want to hurt me will do that analysis. Why would they hesitate if it is a public thing, if I have a partner, even an unlikely one? Miguel swallowed. They'll hesitate because they don't want to be seen as attacking your partner. He could feel the words already drilled into his mouth like dentures that did not quite fit. It makes you less of an easy target. Valentina's laugh was a small, sharp thing that did not reach her eyes. Less of an easy target because now I have a janitor in my orbit, she said. You are worth that? Do you understand the cost? He did. He also knew the shape of cost in a different way. The way a missed 2 months of rent could mean eviction, and the way missed inoculations could mean a child lying ill on a threadbare couch. The scales of Valentina Serrano's world and his were made of different metals, but weight still mattered. Yes, he said, and each syllable was a tiny folding of himself closer to the furnace of her life. I do. What neither of them expected was the way the pretense began to peel away in small private ways. On a rainy afternoon, while Valentina reviewed encrypted flowcharts in her office and Miguel tidied the marble vestibule, she asked him a question that had nothing to do with optics or defense. Why do you clean? She asked. It was not about employment. It was a softer probe into motive. He raked his fingers through his hair, surprised by the intimacy of the stray inquiry. "I clean because someone has to," he said. The answer was blunt, honest, almost too small for the weight of the setting. "Because I have a daughter, because people like me don't have other options, and because it's a job that keeps me close enough to where I can earn enough." She studied him in silence, the way someone studies a map before deciding whether to trust it. "You were a medic," she said suddenly, as if drawing a single thread from a tapestry. "You carried people." His face unfolded into memory. Mud, the metallic smell of a makeshift ward, hands with wounds too busy to be polite. He nodded. Once, in places that needed it. He did not speak of the war that had taught him how to be small when required, how to be generous when it mattered. He did not speak of the girl who had been his first patient, and the way death had taught him that promises were brittle. Valentina's fingers found the cold edge of her desk. For a moment, she looked younger, as if the corporate facade had slipped. "I don't imagine much of my life involved bandages," she said. And the dry humor at the edge of her voice was the first thing they shared that felt like a bridge built of fragile wood. "My husband," her voice cracked and then closed. "We did things on a scale that required cruelty sometimes. I was good at reading numbers. I was not trained in saving." Miguel understood the confession as a confession. For a woman who commanded a modern crime dynasty, admitting incompetence in tenderness was a risk. "Saving is messy," he said. "It involves favors people don't owe you. It involves giving up what you might get someday for someone who needs it now." The conversation made them both uncomfortable by being real. It also set a pressure under the pretense if they were practicing an intimacy for optics, they were simultaneously encountering the raw materials of genuine connection, shared stories, small vulnerabilities, a mutual recognition of what had been lost. The more authentic the bond felt, the more lethal the risks around it became. Outside the shiny shell of the tower, their enemies continued to rearrange themselves into portfolios of threat. The cartel's algorithm did not sleep. It harvested data at strange hours and wove it into threats like a spider. Valentina's analysts reported anomalies in satellite feeds and a string of bank accounts siphoned quietly into cold wallets. A compromised corporate partner in a neighboring country canceled contracts and then leaked documents to a tabloid. A hacker, known only by a skull avatar and a persona named Iago, posted a mock obituary on a message board. Valentina Serrano, taken by her own sooner than she thought. The message was a threat wrapped in dark humor. Miguel found that the more public the story of his heroism became, the more private his life felt exposed. Unknown numbers called at 3 in the morning, and emails arrived with thinly veiled warnings about the child of a skittish janitor. He found stickers on his van, symbols he recognized from old conflicts, crossed out with an ugly pencil. He would drive Lena to school with hands that trembled and believe that no visible harm had come their way simply by the grace of routine. One afternoon, he stopped to buy Lena an orange at a corner stand, and a man shadowed him a little too closely, letting his foot tap the rhythm of intent against a curb. Miguel felt the weight of being watched like a small stone in his shoe. His training told him to notice the patterns, for the way a man's fingers tucked into pockets, for the angle of his head. But his heart told him the worst, that by stepping into Valentina's life, he'd given his enemy leverage. He moved through the crowd and let the man pass. He did not confront him. Violence would invite violence in a spiral he could not control. Instead, he walked faster to the bus stop, pretending he did not notice the trail. That night, Valentina called. She had been at a press dinner, playing the part of the grieving yet unbowed widow, and now she wanted to speak plainly. "Tell me where you were when the man followed you today," she said. Miguel named the street. He lied about the exact path he'd taken. He could feel his throat tighten with the taste of fear and the hot, slow heat of shame. "I'm fine," he said. "I was careful." Valentina was quiet for a long second. "You're not," she said finally. And because I know that now, because you let me know, then I will not let you be easy prey." There was an edge to the words that was not found in corporate memos. This was a private threat, the kind that meant action would be taken. He imagined what that action could look like: armored cars, a driver who knew blind spots and how to take the underpass, a schedule of lessons in how to recognize danger. He also imagined the cost, the visibility that would come with protection, the questions from neighbors, the whispered rumors in school queues. Miguel had not wanted this. He had wanted the smallest possible intervention to keep Lena safe. Instead, he had become a chess piece in someone else's endgame. When they met 2 days later to rehearse a staged interview, the chemistry between them had the oddness of two strangers who had shared a dangerous secret. On camera, Miguel was tender and heroic. Off camera, they argued about curfews and protocol with a rawness that felt like intimacy and like collision at once. He wanted her to be more careful. She wanted him to be less prideful. They negotiated terms like a couple bargaining for the last slice of bread in a famine. "Don't go places without telling someone," Valentina said, tapping her finger on a stack of briefing notes. "I will arrange a driver. I will increase your pay. I will not let you be put in harm's way." He laughed, not with humor, but with the weary disbelief of a man used to managing small economies. "You can't buy my dignity with cash," he said. "I'm not trying to buy it," she replied. "I'm trying to keep it whole." They both paused, the sentence caught between them like a management directive hovering above a battlefield. He wanted to tell her that dignity had long been a brittle thing in his pocket, crumpled like a receipt for a purchase that had never been worth the price. He wanted, in that heart-flipping way some small humans want a miracle, to tell her it was possible for things to be gentler. Instead, he said, "I can do this. I'll be careful." Their bargain was a fragile architecture of promises, some practical, some emotional. She would provide protection. He would play the part. She would keep him close to the family orbit. He would keep Lena out of reach. Between the practical arrangements and the rehearsed smiles, there were tender moments that felt improvised and therefore more dangerous. A hand finding another in a crowded room. A look that lasted longer than protocol allowed. The odd joke at the expense of the press that caused Valentina to laugh so abruptly, Miguel almost dropped a tray. They were not lovers, he reminded himself often. They were actors on a stage scripted by necessity. Yet proximity worked in ways no script could anticipate. Miguel, who had always carried his heart folded small like a ticket stub, found himself unfolding in little increments. Valentina, who had been trained by pain to hold herself like a fortress, let fissures of warmth spread at the edges when dealing with the janitor who spoke to her as if she were a person, not an institution. The tension grew like rust at the seams. Each concession made the fabric thinner. Each act of kindness between them braided new threads into a rope that could either save them or strangle them. The outside world watched and speculated. Insiders kept secrets like teeth. Miguel kept thinking of Lena sleeping under the patched quilt, and of the way the quilt smelled of a home he'd made from found pieces. He had not wanted a throne, he had wanted safety. But now he had stepped into a palace with cold floors and gilded traps, and the warmth that had seeped into his chest at the memory of Valentina's lips was both salvation and reckless invitation. When the next threat came, an indirect betrayal that arrived not with gunfire but with an internal file leak showing a Serrano operative's offshore account, everything escalated. Fingers pointed toward a trusted lieutenant who had been seen meeting with a rival in a neutral cafe. Valentina's men were certain there was treachery at close quarters. Miguel watched the room as alliances shifted like tectonic plates, each man's expression a calculation of where to plant the next flag. He felt suddenly small and dangerously seen. Valentina called him into the inner office that night with no cameras, no press, just a circle of men who looked at him with various measures of skepticism and curiosity. "You told me you had been a medic," she said simply. "I need to know whether you can be useful beyond playing my lover in photographs." The question was an unexpected soap of daylight poured into the dark of his life. Miguel thought of the field hospitals where he had learned to read a pulse with his eyes closed, where triage was a language of small mercies and ruthless choices. He thought of Lena and how he had promised to do whatever was necessary to keep her from harm. He thought of how fragile the promise of safety felt when the enemy used invisible code to slice through lives. "I can help," he said, "in small ways. I know how to read patterns. I know how to stabilize people. I can watch a room and tell you what's off." Valentina's look was almost approving, like a professor recognizing an unexpected scholarship. "Then you will help," she said. "You will be more than a story. You will be a presence." Her voice had the gravity of a verdict and the tenderness of a hand that had learned to touch sparingly. Being in Valentina's orbit now meant a schedule of proximity and learning. He was given access to security briefings, with the caveat that his movements be secret and his communications strictly supervised. It was protection, but it was also containment. He was a janitor with a new set of keys and a thicker ledger. The paradox of his new life, being shielded while also staged, gnawed at him. Each time he left Lena to return to the tower, he felt the distance grow like a bruise. Yet, in the 100 tiny acts that followed, a shared cigarette in the rain, a finger brushing hair from a brow during a tense briefing, Valentina arranging for Miguel's van to be parked in the secured lot, they kept building something that neither had asked for, but both could no longer pretend was only about optics. It was dangerous and tender and complicated. The push and pull of their lives tightened like a violin string, humming with possibility and ready at any moment to snap. And somewhere in the nether of data and code, the cartel's algorithm pulsed and learned. It was not a sentient thing, but it behaved like one, adapting, probing, finding seams. The next move would be less theatrical and more surgical. Miguel's heart beat a slow drum. He had lent his life to a dangerous lie. He had done it for Lena, and now he had to do it for something else, someone who, against all predictions, had begun to matter to him beyond strategy. They were no longer simply playing roles. They were practicing how to be each other's refuge in a city where refuge was a fragile commodity. The act of pretending had opened a door that neither had planned to walk through, and behind it lay choices they would soon be forced to make, about truth and consequence, about sacrifice and claiming a place beside one another when the world had taught them both to be alone. The leak hit at dawn like a blade through fog. A curated packet of internal emails, photographs of secret meetings, a ledger of transfers stamped with dates that matched funerals and promotions. It was small enough to be dismissed by those who wanted to, and precise enough to wound where it mattered, naming names, showing signatures, pointing a clean, digital finger at someone inside Valentina's circle. The message came from an account that had once traded in favors and had now gone public, a lieutenant's offshore account seeded with Serrano funds, and the timestamp that made betrayal feel handcrafted. Valentina's long office smelled suddenly like cold coffee and old paper. The portrait of the late patriarch looked angrier than usual. They called a council. The inner room filled with men whose faces were the same as they had been the night of the shooting, measured, unreadable, the way storms in the business printed themselves on human faces. Miguel stood near the door like an extra piece of furniture, unclipped from his usual world and placed, against his will, into theirs. He listened as names were whispered and accusations unfurled. He felt the small animal panic that had lived under his ribs since the kiss curl at his throat, the sensation that now every step he took had a shadow 2 beats behind it. Valentina watched the room as if she were studying a chessboard that had been rebalanced overnight. She moved through the accusations with the cold logic of an exec, but there was a tremor in the edges of her voice he had not heard before, a rawness that made her seem younger, less invested in myth and more in consequence. "Who among you leaked this?" she demanded, and the question hung like a noose. Men shifted, eyes avoiding each other. The lieutenant named in the leak, a man who had once been closest to the late husband's counsel, claimed innocence with a brittle righteousness that did not convince anyone. Then the file did something more dangerous. It included a photograph of Valentina exiting a private clinic the week after her husband's death, a small detail only someone with access to her inner movements could have known. It was not merely money anymore. It was a narrative, a suggested timeline that whispered of internal conspiracy. The room tightened. Whoever had engineered the leak knew how to erode trust. Trust in their world was thinner than the paper these prints had been made on. Miguel felt it all like a cold wind. His own role, which had been contrived as a shield, now made him vulnerable in unforeseen ways. He could see the logic. A janitor-turned-lover gave the family plausible deniability and an unexpected public softness. But a lover also meant access. Unsupervised moments, unscripted nights. The possibility that a man who cleans closets might accidentally scrub up something dangerous. He remembered the man who had followed him earlier that week and the stickers on his van that had not been random graffiti. Now those small threads wove into a web he had never meant to step into. Valentina called him to her side after the council ended, her expression shuttered and precise. "I want truth," she said. "I want you in my head on this. I am not asking for heroics. I am asking for clarity. Can you do that for me?" He had not expected to be asked for more than a good performance, but he nodded. "I'll do what I can," he said. "I can watch patterns. I can track who communicates with who. I'm not an analyst, but I can tell you when something feels wrong." She regarded him like one might regard a fragile instrument, useful if handled correctly, dangerous if dropped. "Be honest," she warned. "If you hide anything, I will know. Our enemies use secrets like teeth." For the first time since the staged kiss, Miguel felt something like being seen without the armor of a lie. It was terrifying and intoxicating. He agreed to sign a brief, a document that gave him limited access to internal feeds and obliged him to report oddities through Valentina's secure channel. The paper smelled like government offices and new money. Signing it felt like stepping over a line he could not unmake. Over the next days, the cracks multiplied. An analyst whom Valentina had trusted for years missed a scheduled briefing and blamed a family of hackers. His absence coincided with a flurry of transfers traced back to an intermediary account. A courier known for loyalty was found to have met with a rival's fixer in a cafe 2 blocks from the tower. Each revelation splintered the sense of order the Serrano name relied on. Accusation rippled out like thrown stones. Men who had once smiled across tables now watched each other for slippage. Miguel's involvement placed him at the center of a storm he understood only partly. He learned quickly to sit in rooms where people used words he did not wholly comprehend. Derivatives, shell accounts, data laundering. And to watch faces for the moment when truth leaked in the eyes. He grew adept at noticing the tiny betrayals. A hand that trembled when asking for a refill. A laugh too fast. A name dropped like a coin. Valentina, watching him learn, would sometimes brush a hand against his arm, an almost imperceptible signal that she trusted his observation. Those touches were grass breaking through concrete, small, impossible, and full of meaning. Then, in a betrayal that cut deeper than public leaks, someone left a voice message on Miguel's phone impersonating a child protection officer, hinting that Lena's school attendance was under review and that custody could be questioned because of the father's association with a criminal enterprise. The message was a scalpel aimed at his softest place. Miguel felt the floor tilt under him. For the first time, he wanted to walk away from the charade, to return to the margins from which he had tried to hold his daughter safe. The thought lasted 2 seconds before Valentina's words in his ear stopped him. "You're not alone." When he confronted her, late, in the hall outside the surveillance room where monitors glowed like watchful moons, she did not offer platitudes. She told him she had traced one of the leaks to a man who had been under her husband's payroll and had recently been demoted. "He will be dealt with," she said. "But this is bigger. Someone is aiming to make us implode from within." Miguel's chest ached with complicated loyalties. Why would they do this, he asked. He was asking for Lena and for a truth he suspected might hurt. "Because power looks like a fortress until it doesn't," Valentina said. "And because we are built of people. People fail. People sell when the price is right." The word sell stung in a way that conjured corrupt board meetings and quiet betrayals, and also the old NGO field hospital where someone had traded supplies for safety. He found his anger folding inward like steel tempered by years of needing to hold himself small. "Who can we trust?" he asked. Her answer was a list of names and a handful of instructions. Go nowhere alone, don't engage certain communications, be ready for a quick extraction. But then she surprised him. "Trust yourself," she said. "Trust what you notice. And trust me, Miguel. I can't afford to be wrong about who I let near me." Those words landed with a force that felt less like an order and more like an offering. He thought of Lena and of morning cartoons and of the small dignity of grocery receipts and realized that whatever this life was becoming, withdrawing would not keep him safe. Protection under Valentina's wings meant more visibility, but also muscle and influence. It was a calculus he had always avoided, trading freedom for shelter. But now the stakes were Lena's face in the early light and the way she counted stars as secrets. Yet the fissure in their fragile shelter widened when the lieutenant the leak had implicated called a press conference of his own. He stood before cameras and proclaimed his loyalty to the family while insinuating that Valentina had been compromised by outside forces and poor counsel. The claim was a public smear dressed as defense. It was a move designed to force choices. Side with him and risk being tied to a treasonous ledger, or side with Valentina and risk being labeled as complicit in cover-ups. Men around the table recalculated allegiance as if the country were a scoreboard. Miguel watched the colors shift. He realized with a cold certainty that the thing he had done to save her life, an impulsive kiss, had become a vector for leverage. If he embraced the role of lover too wholly, he would be painted as a co-conspirator. If he resisted his part, Lena would be vulnerable to reprisals. The lie that protected had metastasized. That night, as rain thudded against the tower and city lights smeared into watercolor, a new message found its way into Valentina's inbox. A video of a man in a hood, voice disguised, saying simply, "We know your weaknesses." The video was followed by a list, an address where Lena's after-school tutor lived, and a photograph of a sleeping child, blurred but recognizable by a small stuffed dinosaur on the bed. Miguel's stomach fell out. Anger rose like hot iron. He wanted to charge the building, to tear down servers, to shout and demand, and maybe to hurt someone so thoroughly they could never plan threats again. Valentina, meeting his fury, stopped him with a touch and a cold, unblinking stare he had learned to respect and fear. "We will not react like animals," she said. "We will strategize. We will not feed their hunger with rash moves, but we will protect her." Protection in the Serrano lexicon meant containment and movement and resources. It also meant consequence. Miguel realized the cost again. He had not only tied himself to Valentina's world, he had pulled his daughter into an escalation that would change both their lives. The protective shield he offered had become a magnet. In the quiet that followed, as both of them plotted and argued and, for a furtive moment, simply watched each other while monitors hummed, the fragility of their bond was stark. It had begun as a desperate theater trick and had become a fragile alliance stitched together by necessity, tenderness, and now betrayal. Secrets amplified the fractures. Each revelation widened the gap between the life Miguel had known and the life he now lived. They were bound together by danger and by an unexpected care that made the choice to protect more agonizingly intimate. Valentina, who had once measured everything in ledgers, now measured in seconds and small human risks. Miguel, who had always chosen the smallest path that kept Lena safe, found himself walking into corridors of power and treachery he'd never intended to know. The distance between their worlds pulsed with the promise of ruin and the possibility of something like redemption. If they could survive the next web of lies and the next betrayal, coming fast across a city that had learned to weaponize data and human fear. They moved like two people learning a new language in the middle of a fight. Clipped syllables, urgent syntax, the softening of voices where the cameras couldn't hear. The breach that threatened Lena had transformed Valentina from a monarch into a guardian who understood, suddenly and ferociously, that power without tenderness killed the last things worth saving. Miguel watched her plan with the terrible, protective awe of someone seeing a machine built of marble learn to weep. She ordered the tutor moved, a decoy apartment rented 2 blocks away, a driver on rotation. She signed papers that rearranged guards' footwork like a general redeploying troops. None of it felt like victory. It felt like hunkering down until someone smarter made a mistake. Then she did something that surprised him more than the strategy. She handed him a key. It was small, an unremarkable brass thing, stamped with access codes. And when he took it, he felt a current under his skin, as if acceptance could be a shock. "This opens the internal safe," she told him. "You will keep it on you. If they come for the child, you will leave a trail that will lead them away. If they follow, they will find nothing but a ghost. Do you understand?" Miguel's throat tightened. The plan was simple in its cruelty. Lose a part of yourself to save the rest. "And if they catch me?" he asked. "Then you do what you're trained to do," she said. And for the first time she spoke not as a queen, but as a woman who had been on a field and understood triage. Create an opening. Survive. Get her away. They rehearsed the extraction like a dance that could be fatal. The timing of the driver's horn, the loop of the back alleys, the exact phrase the tutor would use in the phone call that would send Lena out the front door 5 minutes later than usual. Miguel learned the routes not as maps, but as promises. They would be small promises, edged in violence, promises that might require him to offer himself as bait. 2 nights later, at dusk, when the city's neon bled into the river, the trap snapped. The decoy apartment's corridor shuddered with the silence of people who had waited too long to be seen. Men in cheap jackets moved like shadows. They had been instructed well. Miguel felt them before he saw them, the way his old training parsed danger in the microsecond between breath and sound. He held the brass key in his palm like a confession. When the first man stepped into the stairwell, Miguel let himself be seen. He stepped out with the precise clumsiness they had practiced, fumbled keys, a mutter about being late, then ran. It was a sprint calculated to draw pursuit, the sort of improvised theater he had done for years in crisis zones, where the best plan was often the simplest lie. The men followed as expected, knives flashing briefly when the light caught them. They had the arrogance of hired intent. Valentina watched from a rooftop camera feed, lips pressed so thin Miguel could see her jaw in the monitor as if through glass. He heard the static in his ear, the driver waiting 2 blocks away, instructions in Valentina's voice like a hymn. Miguel sprinted down an alley, heart pounding like a drum, the city reeling around him. He ducked into a subway underpass and let the echoes hide him. A man lunged. Miguel felt metal bite the air near his shoulder. He twisted, fell, rolled. Blood and grit painted his palms. He ran. Every part of him urged retreat, but retreat now meant someone else could die. When the assailants realized the bait led to nowhere, they dispersed with curse and calculation. The hunt was adaptive, and missing prey made them redouble focus on the Serrano center. Miguel limped the last block to the van, where the driver, a man with steady eyes, sped them away. He thought he had done it, sacrificed a night, maybe a few stitches, but as the van pulled away, his phone vibrated with a live feed. An encrypted camera had caught him collapsing, and someone had turned that collapse into a message. It was a provocation. Expose him. Paint him as a perpetrator who had endangered the child deliberately. Valentina did not hiss with fury. She moved. She called a press conference the next morning with calm so precise it trembled. She thanked their enemies for revealing themselves and offered a narrative that placed Miguel not as a co-conspirator, but as the flawed, brave protector. She did not hide his wounds. She displayed them like truth. Her vulnerability made the cameras hungry in the right way. Humans trusted visible pain. They pitied visible sacrifice. The narrative splintered the attacker's message. The cartel had sought to humiliate. Valentina answered with ownership. Miguel watched her that day from the hospital bed where a nurse had dressed his shoulder. Gauze bandaged the taste of iron from his mouth. Valentina arrived with one aide and no entourage. She sat on the edge of the bed, and the hum between them was not theater now, but a fragile truce of proximity. "You bled for me," she said simply, and the admission was a thing as small and enormous as a wedding vow. He wanted to say he had done it for Lena, to place the small world truth into the wide one, but the words tangled with pride and fear. Instead, he asked quietly, "Did it help?" Her hand closed over his with firm, deliberate heat. It was not the quick patronage of a benefactor, but the touch of someone finally choosing a person. "It did," she said, "but it also did something to me." Her voice pitched low. "It made me see that I can be dangerous and tender at once. I can govern without erasing." That admission shifted something between them. Miguel felt his own defenses thin in a way that was not fear, but relief. They had traded sacrifice. She had strategized the public face into a fortress. He had been the bleeding hinge. He understood then that power could be repurposed, not only to wound, but to protect what mattered. He felt less like a pawn and more like a man whose choices altered a map. Valentina's fingers tightened and then eased, as if testing a claim she had not written in any ledger. The days that followed were an uneasy truce with chaos. The cartel dug in with digital malice, bank accounts scrubbed, blackmail offers sent in encrypted chains. But Valentina's team fought back with legal traps, corporate fences, and aggressive PR that made the cartel's methods noisy and thus less precise. Miguel became integral in the security rotations, his med-epic instincts helping to triage panic rooms set up for press days and school transfers. His presence in the inner work became less pretense and more contribution. There was a moment, weeks after the extraction, when the city seemed to hold its breath, where Valentina and Miguel stood in the tower's inner garden, an improbable patch of green under a glass roof. Rain freckled the panes and the empire hummed below. He saw grief catch in her throat as she looked at the small, guarded face she had been building for herself. "We could let this be a bargain," she said. "You keep the child safe, and we call you ours." He looked at her, at the scar that had been mapped by gunfire and decision, and thought of Lena sleeping under the patched quilt. "I don't want to be owned," he said, "but I do want to be tethered." Valentina surprised him then. She closed the distance between them and kissed him, not for cameras, not for strategy, but because the line between saving someone and wanting to be saved blurred into one act. It was a soft thing, a trade of breaths and promises. When they parted, she whispered, "Then be tethered to me." The sacrifice he had made, his body, his anonymity, moved from being a single night's theater to a strand in a new weave. He had stepped into power's orbit and found tenderness. She had folded a little of her armor away and offered him not a title, but a place. They both knew the city had not finished with them. There would be more raids, more leaks, nights of calculation, and choices that tasted like iron and chocolate. But in that green-lit garden, beneath a sky pressed to glass, they claimed one another in a way that shifted the maps, an exchange of protection for presence, sacrifice for claim. When they left the garden, the world outside still demanded war, but they walked back into it with a shared script: the Donna who would not be softened into obsolescence, and the janitor who had learned to fold courage into strategy. They had saved a child, and in the process had risked becoming something new, a partnership born of necessity and sealed by a kiss that had been both armor and invitation. The next move would come from the cartel, from traitors, from the city's hungry machines. But whatever came, Miguel and Valentina had decided to face it together, and that made all the difference. The city learned to breathe around them. Protection became ritual: drivers on rotation, decoy apartments, encrypted school transfers. The cartel's algorithm throbbed and sputtered against legal traps, and counterintelligence Valentina ordered like a surgeon steering incisions. Men who had spoken loudly in council grew quiet or were quietly moved out of reach. The lieutenant who had tried to carve himself into history with a smear disappeared into paperwork and exile. His offshore accounts were traced and frozen, and other mouths that had once whispered threats learned that the Serrano family could litigate as well as retaliate. Small victories stacked like plates in a kitchen: noisy, fragile, necessary. Miguel traded nights of mop and solitude for nights in briefings and brief moments of sleep in a safe house. Lena adjusted to a driver she called the big kind uncle, and Miguel watched her reclaim childhood as if it were a species returned from extinction. She drew pictures of the tower and of a man with a mop who was also a hero, and he taped them to the inside of his locker like a flag he could look at when fear edged his hands. Valentina moved differently in the days after the crisis. She kept the family ledger balanced, but also learned the small domestic languages Miguel had taught her: how to fold a shirt gently, how to make coffee that tasted like warmth rather than command. Her team respected the shift because it worked. A leader who could govern ruthlessly and offer tenderness when required was harder to topple. She insisted the narrative remained theirs to tell. She curated the story of Miguel not as a pawn, but as a partner, an intentional elevation that protected them both. They were imperfect together. Old habits clashed: Miguel's distrust of power, Valentina's reflex to control. But those jagged pieces fit in ways neither expected. They argued about curfews and secrecy, about when to hide and when to expose, and in the soft dark of an unguarded hour found themselves laughing at absurdities only they could share. Trust, once a word heavy with cost, became a practice: small tests, honest reports, a hand offered and taken. The cartel's noise dimmed but never vanished. Threats were now met with plans that included both force and mercy. The world outside their window still calculated in ledgers and algorithms, but inside their clasped hands they had created a different currency. Valentina taught Miguel to read maps of influence. He taught her how to bandage without flinching. Lena learned that bravery could be ordinary. On an ordinary morning, with rain freckling the tower's glass and the city moving like a pulse below, Valentina stood at the kitchen counter in a sweater that softened her edges. Miguel, in an old t-shirt, poured 2 cups of coffee. He reached across steam and the clatter of spoons and kissed her, not for optics, not as armor, but because the world had shifted enough that tenderness no longer felt like a liability. She answered with a softness he had never expected to earn. They did not pretend danger had ended. It was a truth they carried like a scar, visible, a reminder. But they had learned to be each other's shelter and to trade power for presence. In a city that measured value in influence and fear, they created value in quiet, defiant care. Together, they walked back into the light, tethered, imperfect, and finally belonging.